All right.
Oh, there's Corey. Hey, Corey.
Yes. Hey, everyone.
Perfect timing,
I'm
Corey.
on time. I'm actually not late yet, but unless I'm not early, so maybe I'm late.
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. We'll
We
give everyone maybe we'll start at 3 minutes after the hour or 2 minutes after that. We'll give everyone another minute or so.
I'm going to switch headsets really quickly. I'll be right back because the Bluetooth just ran
Yeah, I'm likely to have to do that here soon, but we'll just kind
out.
of figure it out as
Take
we
me a
go.
second.
Okay.
Everybody still there?
Yep.
Okay.
Give just one more, about 30 seconds here. We'll get started. Monique's on. Great. Yeah. Why don't we just go and get started with a few introductory slides and who's driving? Sorry. Is that Demery?
Demery.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gravity Implementation Affinity Group. I'm Corey Smith. I am with the American Medical Association, but I'm the technical director for the Gravity project. Just a few notes here before we get started. This session is being recorded, and this is our antitrust practices. So the short version of this is, you should refrain from any discussion here that may provide the basis for an inference that they have agreed to take any action relating to prices, services, production. Vanessa, you do the slide better than I. You shouldn't discuss things that you wouldn't discuss privately, here in this public forum. Essentially, is really what we'd say there.
Anything that can be construed as cornering of markets or price fixing across the market, we want to avoid. So this is the antitrust policy. So if you wouldn't share something in other public settings like conferences or trade shows, it's best to save those for another time since this is a public call.
Thank you, Vanessa. Next slide,
No
please.
problem.
All right, so Gravity Project, as you all know, is brought to us by our sponsors, members, and partners, and we are grateful for all of them listed on the screen. Please, we always need more members to fund this work. So please, if you're interested in joining as a member, you can contact us. Next slide, please. This is just a house. So I said this is being recorded. The recording will be available on our Confluence page. Please mute yourself when you're not actively speaking. Please use the raise hand function to chime in with questions or comments and use the chat to share. And then if you're having technical difficulties, you can please contact Demery. Next slide, please. All right, so quick overview of the agenda, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenters today. I want to we're going to go through a number of topics. I want to just preface this conversation. This is a pretty detailed, this is a detailed technical implementation presentation. I think, the implementation affinity group, I think we have a wide range of presentations that happened in this space, some ranging from very technical to some ranging from more sort of project level presentations. And I think as a group, we might start working toward giving you some advance notice about whether this is a technical presentation or something other. But today, I just want you all to know this is a detailed technical implementation presentation, but it's technical because in detail because it's based on the real world. What we're presenting to you today is really a follow-on from a previous implementation affinity group call where we started to give some visibility about the learnings of the Gravity project from our work with the New York State 1115 waiver implementation. And in that previous presentation, we talked about how to make a decision between question and response and a observation screen response. This is a follow-on to that conversation and reflects some of the additional learnings and questions that we've had to help and work through with New York to make important implementation decisions. So with that, I'll say the agenda today, Jim Shalaby will kick us off from Alimu Informatics. with a bit of a fire resource overview. And again, it's a bit of a review of some of the work that we presented in that implementation affinity group two meetings ago, I believe. And then we'll get into some more of the guidance. The meat of the presentation will be on some guidance that based on our learnings from working with the team in New York, we are feeding that work back in to provide more clear implementation guidance around, specifically today, we'll talk about questionnaire responses and observations. Again, how do we make that decision? That's a bit of a review, some real world application of observation screening responses, and then some information related to how to group these screening responses and another concept, time permitting, around structure maps. But essentially, we'll do our best, because there's a lot of detail, to give the audience a sort of what is the business problem we're trying to solve, because all the technical details are rooted in solving real world specific problems that we're encountering with, I shouldn't say problems, maybe requirements, real world requirements that we're finding with our friends in New York and elsewhere. Again, I think this is an opportunity for all of us to learn. Even for those of us who are deep in the weeds, we're learning. So I hope there's something that you can all find to learn. Where we learn from you all as well. So before, I'll stop talking in a minute. So as we go through in terms of questions, as I said, I think there will be opportunity to ask questions, and we'll also welcome your feedback. After the call, saying like, this was way too much. Do something. We welcome your feedback on how to make these sessions more valuable for everyone going forward.
There will be a survey link for that feedback in the follow-up email to this session. So please take a look and give us that feedback. We'd really appreciate it.
All right. With that, I would like to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jim Shelby.
And I'll just interrupt
thanks, Corey.
quickly, Corey,
Yeah,
that
sure.
there were some, I had gotten one email already that someone was having trouble getting in, and seeing that the numbers are a little low. I'm just going to make sure that Demry watches her email in case people are having trouble getting in.
Thank you, Monique.
Yep.
Demery, did you get that?
I did. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Without further ado, Jim.
Oh, great. Thank you, Corey. So today we're going to just cover observation and questionnaire response overview. Really, this corresponds to FHIR's way of representing screeners, assessment instruments. What I'm not going to cover today, but probably cover in the future, are what do you do with this, the referrals. So that'll be a different topic covered in the future. But today we'll cover the FHIRization of screening instruments, forms, or instruments. So if we go to the next slide. So FHIR questionnaire, is basically, a questionnaire is the equivalent of a screening instrument. You've seen them as PDFs. You've seen them in many formats other than FHIR. These instruments are represented as questionnaires in FHIR, so questionnaire resource. And the questionnaire resource, think of it as being basically an empty form or an empty template. It's not patient specific. It's a blank template. After it's administered to a patient and the patient answers the questions, then it becomes a FHIR questionnaire response. And that's why the resource is called questionnaire response, is that it contains the patient's responses to these questions. Okay, so it's a completed questionnaire. The questionnaire response in FHIR is a resource. It's basically a collection of data elements that are built off of the questionnaire template. So it's the two are very closely related to each other. As we go through the presentation, you'll hear us talk about questionnaire response. We really mean questionnaire as it's answered by patients in a questionnaire response. Okay. So if we go to the next slide. So let's look at the questionnaire response. So a questionnaire response is really intended to be a faithful representation of the instrument. So a questionnaire is a SDOH assessment instrument itself, but represented in FHIR. Okay. The questionnaires structure and complexity are really preserved in the questionnaire response. We'll see an example of that in a minute. But that's not the case for another FHIR resource called an observation that we'll look at. And there's some pros and cons between the two, but some important structure and metadata that cannot be represented within the questionnaire response can be captured in the observation. So I'm just going to plug that in as we look at observation. And then question answer pairs in a questionnaire response can be automatically transformed to FHIR observations, because one of the common questions we get are, well, gee, we have two different ways of representing this information in FHIR. You can capture questionnaire responses or you can capture observations. Do we have to do it? How is it a standard? Do we have to do it twice? How do we know when to process a questionnaire response versus an observation? There's a way to relate the two to each other and we'll look at that in our future guidance in a few slides going forward. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a questionnaire response and that illustrates structure. So this is a build-up slide. So if we could just hit the next button. Yeah, so questionnaire depends on, this questionnaire depends on reference images. It's asking, do you see double image or no double image? But to give a reference, there's a picture of a sharp dog and a blurry dog. And you get an idea, the user of that, or the patient taking this survey instrument, gets a reference point to understand when to say their severity of double vision might be none, ranging from none all the way to severe double image. If you hit the next, and so it also has a scale, that's no double image to severe, but it's a whole scale. These kind of things are useful when we're presenting a questionnaire to a patient to be able to answer it, but they're not easily representable in computable queryable data. And so we'll see what observations role is later, but let's go ahead and look at the next slide. So structure is sometimes complex and important. This is just one example. There are many other examples of structure complexity, including questions that are conditional, that branch out to other questions, depending on what questions you answered to prior to that were yes or no. So if we go to the next slide. So here's a representation of what's not captured by questionnaire response. Okay, so this is a questionnaire. And the question here is, there's a series of questions. This section here is questionnaire response. So I'm not quite pointing at one question. I'm just pointing at that whole panel that you just see appear. So if you click next, this is the observation, and this is what's contained in the observation. A little bit of a different structure. If you hit next, the observation has specifies categories of social determinants. It's like a social determinant domain. So this questionnaire is about homelessness, okay? And this section of the questionnaire is about homelessness. If you hit next, you'll also notice, whoops, one too many next, yeah. So you'll notice in the green boxes show that the observation on the bottom actually the derived from points back to the questionnaire. So one thing that's very powerful in FHIR is that we're able to administer the questionnaire in human-friendly form, but we're able to generate observations from the answers to those, and questions and answers to this questionnaire. But we're also able to point the observation back to the original questionnaire in case anybody needs to go back and see what did the patient originally say in that questionnaire. Okay, so the derived from allows us to create that link between the observation and what questionnaire it came from. That's also important in situations where we need to answer questions such as, did you use the CMS AHC HRSN questionnaire to get this question asked? The derived from can point to a specific type of questionnaire that's required. Okay. So next. So let's take a look at the FHIR observation. So FHIR observations add important structure and metadata. So you saw category was added, which specifies what domain of SDOH. That's just one example of what it adds. Observation is supported by most EMRs. It's been around a long time. Laboratory test results, vital signs, interpretations of imaging. Those are all in EMRs done as observations. So it's a little more mature on the FHIR side. Observations more easily searchable and queryable. So it supports querying. Unfortunately, observation can't represent the structure of a questionnaire. The blurry dog to clear dog and the scale that you saw in the previous example, that's something that is not representable in an observation. So we go to the next screen or next slide, sorry. So what ties them together? This is just an advertisement for another FHIR resource called Structure Map. So Structure Map is pretty powerful. It's basically a set of rules that can write to ease the effort of translation of a questionnaire response, question answer pairs to observations. And so it's portable, it's flexible. It doesn't require, it's not required, but it's really highly recommended because of that flexibility and portability. So you go to the next slide. So now we'll get into the implementation guide guidance. So where do we start with question? Do we choose to start with questionnaire response or observation? It's not really an or. It's what is the situation? What is your intended use? And what do you have upstream? So one important point is it depends on how your assessment instrument is documented. Is the format of the assessment instrument a PDF? Or is it a structured format? And if it is a structured format, it lends itself to creating a FHIR questionnaire response. If it's a PDF or paper form or something that's less structured, you may not have questionnaire responses upstream and you may need to go straight to observations. And then what type of information do you need to use it for? Are you planning to do queries or computations of the questions and answer pairs? Most organizations, most systems actually collect data on these forms to do something with it. Analysis or decision support typically are the big ones. So most situations you do want to do something with it, and so you will probably need an observation to be able to do the querying. So we go to the next slide. So we provided a guidance slide to make these decisions. When do I use a questionnaire response versus when do I use an observation? The work and experience we had with New York was really illustrative of the first usage need. New York needed to be able to do querying and searching across observations, the question answer pairs in a computable way. They didn't really need the format and didn't really necessarily have access to the format of the questionnaire because it wasn't really in the native source always structured. In fact, it was rarely structured. So we went down the path of saying, let's use observation. That's really the best fit. Okay. And the guidance is really that it's computable, it's searchable. You can actually query it. If it's necessary to determine which question answer pairs are represented in the observation, those are easy to identify. What's not easy to identify is the structure. Okay. The second usage is a very is if you have a query, if you need to query discrete question answer pairs, okay, and you also need access to the native format. You want to know what did the form look like that as it was represented and presented to the patient, okay? So you need both. In that case, you need a questionnaire response representation of the form, but you also need the observation representation of the form, okay? And this is really the most common scenario. It's again, if you have a structured form upstream that can actually lends itself to being a questionnaire response. If you don't, then the first usage is really where you're starting. The last usage is if you plan to do nothing with the data as far as querying or computation, and you just need the original format of the form as natively as it was presented to the patient. Okay, and in that case, the questionnaire response meets that need. You don't really need an observation translation of that because you don't plan to do any querying or any computation off of that data. Okay, and put in red here that this is highly unlikely. It's very unusual when you collect information that you plan to do nothing with. Okay. So if we go to the next slide. So real world applications, and I think if we go to the next one, Monique, you have some nice examples that we can start discussing. Oops. What happened here?
Yeah, so I'll
Maybe
share it.
while we're switching, can you all hear me?
Yeah. Hi,
Yep.
Corey.
Yeah. So I think just to kind of summarize where Jim, what I think, while we're in the standards business, implementation of standards is not always standard. There's not a one size fits all solution for everybody. And really the how you implement the standards, in this case, questionnaire response and observation screening response, is really a function of what your needs are. And I think that's really, if there's one, maybe that's obvious, but I just thought I would add that. So go ahead, Minnie.
Thanks, Corey.
All right, so you can see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so Jim has outlined to you a bit about, questionnaire response, and observation screening response. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'll sort of talk about two aspects of observation screening response that we're trying to take advantage of in the Gravity project. And one is observation category, which lets you sort of bucket the observation.
Monique, I don't think you advanced. Are you trying to advance the slide?
No, I haven't advanced yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, that's okay, Jim. Yep. So the first one is going to let you kind of bucket the observation into a category or an SDOH domain, like food insecurity, just to tag it. The second will be observation interpretation, which we're going to discuss how you can use that to flag an observation as being sort of positive as a possible health-related social need and for follow-up. So I'll start with observation category. This is the element on observation that we're allowing you, or we've profiled the profile to allow you to categorize observations into certain buckets of social determinant of health domain. And so that's when you use an observation screening response to represent the question answer pair, this option becomes available to you where it's not available in, say, questionnaire response. And for this category, Gravity has added a value set bound to that offers what are currently as codes, the domains that Gravity has already addressed as a project. So you'll see most of the domains here that we've all worked through on the community calls. And then we, since Gravity is a project that is ongoing and not every domain has already been addressed, we offer the sort of equivalent of not otherwise specified, just a generic term in here for a domain that might not yet be dealt with in Gravity, but where you at least want to flag the observation as being, a social determinant of health-related observation. So that's where we'll start. And now if we, go a little further, the way we're asking that you approach this is that you think of observation category as not only applying to a specific question answer pair that observation represents, but a certain question is allowed to have a complete set of answers. And I'll give examples of this. And we ask that you look sort of at the complete set of answers and the question to sort of determine what domain or domains should be assigned to that observation. And there will be plenty of examples in subsequent slides. And so what we're saying it means when you pick a social determinant of health domain for this category is that observation is going to provide you some information about a health-related social need in that specified category. So if you pick food insecurity, this is saying there's some information in this observation related to food insecurity. What it does not mean is that this observation confirms food insecurity in this individual. And we're emphasizing that because many of these domain terms align with diagnoses that might be used as the code in a condition, for example. And so we're just trying to, make it clear that that is not the intent. And so I'll give a few examples here. The first one is a standard question, and all these questions are coming off the AHC health-related social needs screening tool. And this question is asking, in the last 12 months, you worried that your food would run out before you had the money to buy more. You have multiple options here, often true, sometimes true, never true. And what we're saying is that this question and the set of answers in their entirety are focused on food insecurity. So this is a question that no matter what answer choice is given, and I'll get to the never true in a moment, anytime you have an observation where this is the observation code, this question, we suggest that you use food insecurity to tag that observation as an observation that's telling us something about food insecurity. Although using never true is not indicating that there is a risk in the food insecurity area, that observation is still providing information related to food insecurity. Now it gets a little more complex, and this is just an example of a question and its complete answer set that might address more than one domain, and there's no constraint on how many domains you can assign here. And so this question is, what's your living situation today? And the individual has a choice of saying, I have a steady place to live, I have a place to live, but I'm actually worried about losing it, which is something that by gravity's definition is housing insecurity. Or they can say, I don't have anywhere to live, I'm homeless right now, which falls into our homelessness category. And yet we would say that this question is really addressing both of these categories with its complete value set. And we just recommend that any observation that has this code get both categories. And, part of the reason for that is that, we don't want you to have to start dissecting down to the question answer pair every time. And many times, like, for example, this answer, I have a steady place to live, but I'm worried about losing it. It's actually telling me that the patient meets the gravity definition for housing instability. But at the same time, because these are mutually exclusive, it's also giving me information that this patient is not homeless. So this is sort of our general advice again about how you can sort of create, high level buckets to sort of start to say, well, if I want to find some information about this, this is an observation I should look at. And then finally, just so that, it's understandable, I mentioned at the beginning that, gravity is an ongoing project. Not every domain is already dealt with. And there are domains that are coming, and there are no value sets yet for them in VSAT. And yet there are questions like this one on the AHC screener that's saying in the last 12 months, has your electric, gas, or oil been turned off or threatened to be turned off? And you have choices of yes, no, and already shut off. Because we have not completed utility insecurity, and there are no value sets for that in VSAC, we suggest that until there such time that the code that you need to define the category is in the value set, choose SDOH category unspecified. This at least tags this as an observation related to social determinants of health. And then FHIR has an additional on category, you can have category text where if you choose locally, you can add text that will allow you to sort of say this is a utility insecurity, or uniformly in your system tag these at a level that you can at least find them by some description that you'd like to assign to them. And so that was a bit about observation category. And now I'll get into observation interpretation, which is a bit trickier. And this is something that you can use to flag an observation that might represent a health-related social need. And we ask you to think about this sort of in the same way, many times FHIR observations, their intent, a lot of them is to represent lab results. So a FHIR observation may have a question like serum sodium level and an answer of 144 or something, some lab observation to represent a serum sodium level. And that sodium level of 144, the lab that does that has a reference range for their values, and they define that reference range. And then observation interpretation for a lab value that says serum sodium 144 could be out of range if that is above the range or above range for whatever that lab has defined as the range. We ask you to think of that in the same way for these screening instruments. And in an ideal world, the authors of the screening instrument will start to provide guidance of what a specific question answer pair might represent, which ones represent health-related social needs. And when they do provide that guidance, and then we say, if they've flagged a question answer pair as a possible health-related social risk or need, we are suggesting that you should use observation interpretation positive. And what that will indicate is that that observation needs follow-up by a provider or a qualified healthcare professional to further evaluate whether there is a health-related social need in the domain that that observation was flagged for by category. So, and I'll give multiple examples of this going forward. What we don't suggest is that when one of the answers chosen is not specified by the instrument's author as representing a need, we don't suggest that you use negative. And the reason I'll show you on further examples of why not, we just recommend don't use observation interpretation at all. And so in subsequent slides here, because this is a little bit of a complex interplay between observation, interpretation, and category, I'll give some examples with respect to the AHC screening tool of how to understand a positive in the context of the category that it's chosen with. And keep in mind that this screening tool is a tool where the authors have clearly stated at the beginning, before any of the questions, that any of the underlined answer choices might represent a unmet health-related social need. So any of those choices, when made, will get a flag of positive. And so the first example is probably, again, our easiest example. And this is where, this question, which is the one that we addressed earlier, only is talking about food. So your option is to say that, you either often worry about it, you sometimes worry about it running out of money, or it never happens. And as we said earlier, that is a category of food insecurity. On that screener, the authors of the screener have said that these first two answers, if underlined, might represent a health-related social need. And for that reason, those two have a positive. And so what's being stated here is that, when you see this combination on an observation, there is some indication in the area of food insecurity that there might be a health-related social risk or need. Now, the second example shows a higher level of complexity, because this is the example that we discussed earlier, stating, what is your living situation today? And the options again are, I have a steady place to live. I'm in the zone where we would call it housing instability. I'm worried about losing it. Or I'm in the zone that we would call homelessness. And so this observation has two category codes. HRSN has stated that if you choose either of these two answers, it might indicate a risk. And so those get a positive. But in this case, to decide which domain or which SDOH category the actual problem exists in, you have to look at the answer here and you have to say, okay, this answer indicates to me that the actual thing that needs further follow-up is housing instability. And in this particular one, you look at the answer and you say, okay, the actual thing that's going to need further follow-up is homelessness. So again, as with any observation result, a practitioner needs to look at it and, make a judgment call. But this is just a way to already start to show, the high priority results and give you some information that there is a possible problem, in one of these two categories. So again, a high level way to flag these observations. And Corey, I can't see if there are questions, but I assume.
Yeah, I'm watching. You're good.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe just since you paused for a moment, I think just kind of, taking stock just for a moment, the category solves the problem of, I want to be able to search across my whole universe of observations for SDOH related observations so that I can separate them from, clinical or laboratory observations. That's sort of one of the business problems category solves. And it also helps you at a high level know what the observation's about, in a broad way. And as Monique is showing us here, the interpretation is a way to start to go one step deeper on the meaning to say, not only is this about homelessness or housing instability, but that this particular observation represents there's actual identified risk here. It's a positive screen, and that's that. And then if you need more details, as Monique said, you can actually look at the questions and answers that were provided to really understand at the most specific level what the actual positive screen was for.
And it may be that after talking to them that they've answered it wrong, or that they're not positive at all, but this is indicating that there might be a risk in one of these categories, and the might is important because that's how it's even worded on the AHC screener. One of the underlined answers might indicate an unmet need. So that's the primary point there. And then the third example is an example where, again, this is an answer choice for the question about the living situation today, where the answer choice does not fall into either of the underlined choices that the authors of this tool designated as indicating a potential risk. So what's your living situation today? I have a steady place to live is addressing homelessness and housing instability, because it's actually confirming that you don't have homelessness. And, however, it isn't ruling out some other problems in this area. It's just saying it's not flagged by this author as a problem. In other words, I can have a steady place to live, and yet I can have moved 6 times in the last year, which might still qualify me as housing insecure or housing unstable if someone talked to me. But this particular answer is not identifying that. And for that reason, while it doesn't get a positive, we also don't put a negative on it because of the misunderstanding that people may think, oh, okay, that means there's no problem in one of these 2 categories. What we're flagging are the potential problems in these categories. And then finally, we allow for the idea that some questions don't have a choice of I refuse to answer or I choose not to answer. And in that scenario, FIRE either requires an observation value or a statement that it wasn't, a value that it's unknown because, an answer wasn't provided. So in the scenario where a question has actually been presented to a patient and they have skipped it, and then, observation data absent reason becomes unknown, or one of its subtypes that we allow in our profile. Again, this is still an observation about food insecurity, but we don't know how to interpret it. And it may be that you in your organization say, well, when people skip an answer, we consider that worse even than, we consider that more concerning than if they choose a never true, which also gets an omit. But it is not a positive. And for that reason, again, all we recommend is just that you don't use observation interpretation. And the provider knows that this is an observation about food insecurity, but it has no interpretation assigned to. And so that sort of covers what Corey highlighted, the 2 uses that are available through observation, these 2 elements on the profile that are not available through questionnaire response, that allow you to start to categorize using observation category, these observations into sort of bucketed domains within social determinant of health, and then to using observation interpretation, at least flag the ones that might be prioritized for follow-up.
Yeah, thank you, Monique. And I think I would just add, in terms of, we're using the word recommendations, like, our implementation guide, it requires you to specify a category. Like, so there's some minimum recommendations that the guide, the profiles require. But, and what we're doing here is, going one step further within the constraints of the profile. How do we best, sort of capture information that advances interoperability and captures the right meaning that to communicate? So there's no, requirement for anyone to do any of this, right? Other than some of the base requirements, like you must include one category. But interpretation, for example, is not, I don't think you're required, the profile, I don't think requires you to populate it. These are just some things we're learning about. If you wish to capture positive screens or wish to, tag, observations in multiple ways. These are just some things we're learning and some guidance that you can choose to apply or not based on your requirements. Okay. Where we are monitoring the question section here, and I'm not seeing anything else. So why don't we move on to the next section here? So, when there is no questionnaire response, how do we tie together a group of related observation screening responses, more specifically question answer pairs in an observation? How do we tie them together so that we know that this collection of observations is related to a assessment, a single
Instrument.
assessment
Yeah.
instrument? Yes. So with that, Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. So observation groupings are a convenience. It's just basically another feature that we have within the observation profile that that allows grouping together a collection of question answers, as observations with their values into a convenient grouping that represents that that assessment instrument. So observation groupings can be used to represent the whole collection. They contain a set of observations to represent the question and answer pairs. That's something to keep in mind. And then observation grouping is really most useful when a questionnaire response is not created. So because if it's already created, you don't really need to do that. As I showed earlier in one of my examples, an observation can point back to the questionnaire response that it came from. Okay. Then the next table that we're going to go over shows some guidance rules around how to create an observation grouping. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. So these are again different scenarios of what a assessment instrument composition might look like. Okay, so if the assessment instrument is a standard assessment instrument, it's the whole instrument, like such as AHC, HRSM, the CMS health related social needs, screener. If that is already in its entirety represented as a codified instrument in LOINC, for example, okay, the grouping can have a code that actually represents the code for the entire instrument, the HRSN instrument. Each observation member of that grouping has its own line code. So each question answer pair basically have their own line codes. And so the entire instrument, along with all of its questions, are coded. Okay. So in contrast, you could have a scenario of non-standard assessment instrument with standard questions. So what this is for example, an HRSN screening tool plus selected questions from a supplemental questionnaire, another tool. Okay, so really the code that can be assigned for the entire grouping would need to be a local customized code. It can't be a LOIN code because there is no LOIN code for this kind of hybrid instrument. It's composed of an entire questionnaire plus questions from another instrument. So its entirety is not represented in LOINC, and however, all individual questions are represented in LOINC. So each of the questions and their answers will have LOINC codes. Okay. The third scenario is a non-standard assessment instrument with standard and non-standard questions. So it's very similar to that previous example we just discussed, but it also includes questions that don't exist in LOINC. They were maybe standardized at the state level, but not part of LOINC and not part of any of the standard instruments that have gotten into LOINC. And in that case, again, the code for the grouping, because it doesn't exist in LOINC, would need to be a local code, a local customized code. The questions that are in LOINC would all have LOINC codes. However, the questions that don't exist in LOINC, those state level questions, for example, would have, again, local codes that would be maintained at that local level. So I think that's it for the guidance. I know that's a lot, but I'll pause here and see if there are any questions. It's a lot to digest.
While we're waiting for questions, I think people, if folks want to come up, you can. I think, just to kind of reiterate, I think the big point here, like questionnaire response is a grouping by nature, right? It is by design a sort of way to wrap a set of related responses into a unit, right? That's just sort of what questionnaire response, one of the aspects of questionnaire response. But if you're not using questionnaire response and you're capturing your questions and answers as individual observations, this whole discussion is about, well, what do I do to aggregate and pull those related observations together in groups, and some of the detailed implementation decisions that sort of, and questions that raises. And again, this is all rooted in sort of the real implementation experience that we've been gaining from our friends in New York.
And
We'll
so
go to
the
the next slide.
ideal case scenario is
Oh,
both.
sorry.
You know, the ideal scenario is you've got that questionnaire response that retains the context and sort of tells you what collection of questions was asked. And you've got observation screening response. And in that case, you probably wouldn't need the grouping. You might, but when you don't have that questionnaire response, then the grouping becomes more important to sort of say, here's the group of questions that were asked at the same point in time from this questionnaire.
Yeah. And this is an example of ideal versus real world. I mean, the real world situation is that frequently questionnaire response doesn't exist yet. Maybe someday it will, but it doesn't right now for many implementers. And frequently the instruments being used, even putting questionnaire response aside, maybe a hybrid, maybe a mix of questions that come from a standard instrument plus questions that are important at the state or local level, but are not part of any standard instrument. So we do see a lot of hybrid scenarios, and that's a real world, kind of situation today. Yeah.
Yes, and I see we have our first hand, Matt Bishop.
Oh, hey, Matt.
Hey there, how's it going?
Good.
So one of the kind of central frameworks of social drivers of health is, or at least the codes that have been created around financial insecurity, housing instability, is we're tracking essentially when there's, quote, a positive result. But what about thinking about these things in terms of a strengths-based framework?
Mm-hmm.
For example, if I'm recording information about someone's income, right? And they make $350,000, it wouldn't make sense to categorize that data under a financial insecurity category, even though does that make sense? Does my question make sense?
It does, yeah. So maybe I'll turn it to Monique. I think about the word protective factors is relevant here, but Monique, why don't you go ahead and take that one?
Yeah, so if a social screener asks what is your income, and it's really looking for the low income individual to assist, that question is still a question about financial insecurity. It's in that domain, whether we argue it's financial security or insecurity, it's providing some information about it. And if you provide an income that's, 250,000, we have discussed that observation interpretation, and we haven't gone there yet, but we might introduce new values like protective factor, or, this is actually something that, might be considered something that's beneficial in this domain. In other words, it's helpful or something, but we haven't gone down it a whole lot, but we've started to have those discussions.
Yeah, and if I would just add one thing, I think in terms of separation of concerns, right? The category allows us to say, of my population, let's say I have a goal to, maybe it's a quality measure, I want to say that I've screened my population across all of these domains, independent of whatever the answers they give me. The category can now allow me to start to say, here are the screening responses that I have for those domains. And then I think, to Monique's point, how we capture sort of the findings or observations associated with the questions we asked, whether they be positive, for risk, or protective in terms of, I think that's sort of a separate important matter that we haven't yet gotten to yet, at least in this work. I know Sarah and the terminology work stream has done a lot of thinking about this, and there may even be terminology for some protective factors, such as, you have food security, for example. That,
or a protective factor may be that if you have food insecurity, but you're enrolled in SNAP or you're
Mhm.
enrolled in a program that's providing you with food, then you may still have food insecurity, but the fact that you're enrolled in a certain program, if that's discovered to be an answer to a question, then that may be a protective factor, even though you're in that domain. So, you know, there's a lot of things to explore here, but there are potential ways to at least start to think about it.
Matt, does that help?
I mean, yeah, it does help. And I'm familiar with the, conceptually with the content of the concept of a protective factor. I guess I'm just thinking about this from a semantic perspective, that it might make sense to have kind of multiple levels of kind of organizing data. One might be like a neutral framing, like finances, or
Mm.
a generic neutral framing, and then within that you would have patients that are in the you know the financial insecurity category because they've been screened positive for these factors, and another category where it was a protective factors. I'm just trying to think about this semantically,
And
not
Mhm.
not exclusively from a knowing how this information would be acted upon, because obviously there's still so much work and research and learning to be done on
Yeah.
how these things come together, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
and
I hear you, Matt. Oh, go ahead,
yeah,
Monique.
we
Sorry.
struggled a lot, you know, even with naming the high level social determinant of health domains. You know, we started down the path of using the terms that are commonly termed for it as social determinants of health, like food insecurity, housing instability, etc. You know, we talked about, you know, should the category be called housing security? But, you know, that's not how it's referred to in common speak. And, you know, if we have a category finances and a value, an interpretation of positive, you know, that has a whole different kind of, well, now what does that mean? So there were, but we did, you know, you'll see it even in the categories we named within gravity. We have a few, like we called, you know, educational attainment, as opposed to lacks a high school diploma, which is actually the problem. So we did waver a bit on that. It's a good point, Matt. You know, we went down the path of sort of labeling it with the label that has the concern, or is the social determinant of health concern as the call out. But, you know, over time, there may be the notion that could need to be revised, but I think we're pretty heavily anchored in that right now.
Mhm.
I was just going to add, Matt, that this is also an evolving, an evolving model, over time, and it happens everywhere in healthcare. Is that, some of these rules may not be represented today in terminology, but may have to be done as, processing on the data that you receive, as you collect information about the patient and apply certain rules to categorize them into risk stratums. But then over time, as those get more established, and the criteria for those get more established, then the tendency is for standard terminologies to start to say, well, we now have clear definitions of what is a high risk, what is a low risk, food insecurity category, and those over time can evolve to be other categorizations in terminology, but that categorization can happen over time as post processing on the data that actually is received about the patient by applying rules, or over time as it evolves and matures and solidifies, can mature to a point where they represent new concepts and terminology.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jim. And, these are things that on the app side can certainly, like you said, be handled on a post-processing basis. That's I think there's understandable attention on the huge health-related social needs that exist in this country, especially amongst medicated uninsured, but not exclusively. I think my question or my point was more directed at, the how do we think about this semantically in terms of also where directions of research and future research might go, in terms of evaluating.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question.
Evaluating like drug addiction, is actually quite common amongst high income people. And what are the, again, I'm not an expert on these topics, any of these individual domains, but and also just psychologically speaking, I think one area of research too that might be interesting is people's willingness to accept services or help, from community-based organizations. And does that change based on like what language you use about how to characterize someone's circumstances? Anyways, I'm kind of rambling at this point. I don't mean to hijack the meeting or anything, but
no, this is good. These are really good questions. Thanks, Matt.
Yep. Yeah, they are good questions, Matt. And I think we just have to we'll keep solving them as they come, but those are, and I think for me, it's like, how do we solve them in a way that is rooted in, requirements that people have? I think that's from a Gravity project in terms of like from a technical director perspective. I think about of all the problems we can solve, we could be way out in the future, or we could focus more on sort of at the edge of the implementation today. And I think a lot of the focus now, and we could debate whether that's the right decision, but for me anyway, I think focusing on the needs in the near to midterm that we sort of see on the horizon is sort of what we're currently focused on from an IG development perspective.
Thanks, Corey. So maybe we could go to the next slide. Just want to make sure we don't run out of time here. And so additional guidance topics. Were there any other questions before I kind of proceed? I think I'm almost done with this section. No?
Maybe this is worth raising here just because as a side note, and we can choose to not go into it, but I did get a side question here about, and calling out that the category codes that were listed in the in the implementation guide are listed in a quote temporary code system, right? In the implementation guide, and what are the implications of asking people to implement using a temporary code system, and is that a barrier to adoption implementation, and is there a better way to a better place to put those codes to promote the use of those category codes?
And I think that the intent will be, that these ultimately will have to go through the THO, the fire, but these will become codes within fire, so out of the temporary code system and into the HL7, an HL7 code system.
Yep. Okay, so more to come on that, but just thanks for that question off to the side, and we'll follow up on paths to places to put that code system, whether it's in our IG or in work with THO and HL7 to get that more in a prime time spot so that implementers can feel comfortable using those codes. Okay, Jim, thank you.
Great.
That's all the questions I see. Those are all the questions.
Great. Thank you. So kind of wrapping it up, we talked about questionnaire response. We talked about observation, but they're not necessarily independent. FHIR offers some machinery to be able to translate from questionnaire response to observations, and one such enabler is the structure map resource. And with structure map, basically you're able to define rules that we can apply to questionnaire response to be able to automatically translate them to observations. Okay, and so it's pretty powerful. It is a little bit complex, but it is an option. It's not required, but it does work pretty well. And in fact, it's probably something that'll in the future we'll see a lot more of when we have standard instruments that are represented in LOINC and over time have FHIR transformations of those. because it really is not something that changes at a patient by patient basis. It just represents the translation of the structure of the form that was translated into FHIR to represent it also as observations. Okay, so these rules are nice because they're portable and they can allow defining these translations. So implementers need to really, before they tackle structure map use, need to understand when and if that should be done, if translation should be done, how the rules to apply to the question and answer pair. So, and then how the condition will be used. So in this example that I'm going to show you, it's translation of the answers to questions into a health concern. Okay, and there are a lot of a lot of times I'll get feedback saying we don't ever want to do that. It's really FHIR enables you to do that. It doesn't tell you you have to do that. It's really your business decision to see, do you have the right types of questions and answers to be able to suggest a health concern. If you don't, you can certainly use structure map to suggest a positive finding, or you can choose not to use structure map at all. So it's completely optional. The reason I mention it is that, again, it facilitates creation of observations from the questionnaire responses without having to repeat it all manually. Okay. So if we go to the next slide, I have a simple example. Okay. And the point here is if we just hit the next button, yeah. So here's a question, food insecurity risk. That's what 88124-3 is. And next slide. Okay, or next, yeah, is the answer. The answer is that it's an answer is the patient's at risk, and that's a code for at risk. And so that's what appears in the questionnaire response question and answer pair. Now, if you hit the next slide, okay, you'll see that the rules will translate that question and answer pair to say, if you see this code as a question, and you see this answer as a response, translate that to an observation. And this observation is a SNOMED code, and it also represents food insecurity. Okay, and that is basically a suggested or health concern. Okay, that's done by rule. That's really all I have to say about structure map for now. And if we go to the next slide, I think we're probably towards the end. Yeah.
And I think we, given there's a lot to say about structure map, and I think it's a lot to say that's worth saying. But again, as you all are aware, this was a dense presentation, and so we just put a little bit of a teaser or possibly some future topics. So thank you, Jim and Monique, for those presentations. Yeah, I think we have plenty of time to have an interactive discussion. Yeah, in fact, I think we have almost a full 30 minutes. So I welcome the group to not be shy, and I think there's a friendly group. So even if you're not sure if your question relates, or I know asking questions in these forums sometimes is scary, but you can please go ahead and feel free to take yourself off mute or raise your hand first, and then we'll happy to field any types of questions. Or comments. Is this it can be about the content, or was this content sorry, Monique, was this was this useful? Is there anything, any comments or questions are welcome. Go ahead, Monique.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that, even in definitely one hot topic has been what Jim just presented, and he alluded to that, auto generation of conditions from structure map. And, on the Gravity page, there is, or on the Gravity Confluence site, there's a resource that sort of shows some suggested codes, ICD-10 and SNOMED, for certain question answer pairs, but with a very clear disclaimer that, these social risks and needs based on an assessment screening instrument should always be verified by a care team member, via a personal interaction with the individual. And so we add that just to allay concerns that, structure map can do this. We're not saying that it should go rogue in the healthcare system and that's why we emphasize the unconfirmed and the health concern as opposed to, putting it on a problem list or saying it's confirmed.
Yes, thank you, Monique. Yeah, just because the technology allows us to generate conditions and codes doesn't mean we should use it. There is a question here in the chat, and I'm not
I
going
think
to
it's a
even
request
butcher.
from Bijan. Yeah.
Yeah, Bijan, thank you.
Bijan's- Yeah.
Yes, I'll read the question. Oh, do you want to ask? Do you want to ask? Take yourself off, Bijan, and ask the question.
And
Sure. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
the query regarding the question about rush instrument weighted by gravity, Sarah will respond to that email. There is another question.
Rush. Oh, RUS. Sorry, it was Rush from Rush. I see.
From Rush, yeah.
It's regarding. I'm just to introduce myself. My name is Bijan Sessanina. I'm contacting on behalf of Riverside University Health System. We're a safety net health system in Southern California. So we were interested to submit our local assessment to Gravity Project just to get it vetted and hopefully included into the approved assessments. And we're hopefully to connect and collaborate more with your project. But I contacted the other email and I hadn't had response, and I had sat in a few meetings. So it sounded like Himali mentioned that there is going to be a response.
Yes, Sarah is out of office this week. I will bring it to her attention next week when she is back in office, and we'll get back to you.
Okay, great. And so I see we have, thank you, Bijan. That's good. So Himali, you have them. I see two hands, Himali and Jacob. I don't know who was first. I apologize. Himali, you took yours down? Thank you, Jacob. You're very polite. Himali, I think, is good. So go ahead, Jacob. I think you're next.
Okie doke. Thank you, Corey and Jim and Monique. I guess my core question has to do with something Monique was just mentioning, which is mapping. A lot of what was talked about today was mapping to terminology standards, which makes sense. And I think it also makes sense, especially for those of us in New York, that you're working on the AHC, mapping of the AHC to some terminology. I guess I would ask and maybe even nudge, remember that the organizations who are doing the majority of this work are not clinical, right? So, and New York, in fact, has been really explicit that their expectation is that the community-based organizations are the ones that are doing most of the work to capture this information, right? So they're doing the screening either verbally or in person or in some other form. I think occasionally it might be a Medicaid member filling out a survey online or on their phone or something. But it sounds to me like the core issues here are going to be perhaps a sort of a one-time activity of mapping the answers to terminology. And so question one is this work in progress? Is this something that you would like engagement from the communities to participate in maybe vetting that mapping? And then what might be the timeline for the completion thereof? Because we're all sort of on the seat of our pants to see, when we can call this ready for prime time or maybe almost prime time. So I know I asked like 7 questions, but Jim's used to that. So have at it.
And I don't know, Corey, if you want to go, but I can answer
I'll just
some
take
of that. Yeah.
I think in terms of like work, sort of official work that sort of documents the, relationships from question answer pairs to interpretation values, for example, or, question answer pairs to category. I don't think we have official work underway to deliver that, and Monique and Himali can keep me honest there. I think we do have the documentation resource that was mentioned earlier, the AHC documentation resource, which isn't a mapping, but provides some guidance on the relevant ICD-10 codes for question answer pairs. So that is done. So in terms of timeline for that is prime time, done, published. But I think there's other work that Monique showed us today that is been sort of experimental kind of research work, but we have not made steps toward sort of productionizing that yet.
And I'll preface by saying that, what we're showing here, which is sort of this first resource to sort of say, how might you go there? In an ideal world, the standardized screeners will have this type of reference resource available so that the CBOs can, you know, code these or map these question answer pairs to sort of the same sets of things if possible.
That's
and
not going to happen though. That's
Yeah.
so see me shake my head like
Yep.
the CBOs are not going to do mapping, right? We can never expect
No,
them to.
yes,
They don't even,
yes.
right? They can't spell ICD-10.
Right.
Nor would we ever want them to, right? So we want them to just do their work. Maybe the social care networks would do that,
Exactly.
but that would be a one-time mapping, right?
Yeah, and Jim and Corey, I mean, this is what we are working on in New
Mhm.
York, right? So they're doing these screeners at a certain level, and then it's coming
Yeah.
in. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, maybe I can help with that a little bit. Yeah, so basically, just taking a step back, we are doing we have a group that's actually terminology, part of Gravity that that is an opportunity for participation and provision of feedback regarding the mapping validation of mappings. Sarah DeSilvi and Hamali and Monique are very deeply involved in that group and in regular meetings. I think that's a group that I think they invite feedback for. And the other thing is that the group's responsible for those one-time mappings for standard instruments will be Gravity, but there are also standards that are actually at the state level, right, and at the county level. And we're like with New York, we discovered that they have needs for certain mappings that they will actually have to maintain on their side that don't become part of Gravity, but become part of the state, mappings that they need to use for assessment and screening. And using similar methodologies to do that, they created their own implementation guide, and for New York, and they started to add these things into the implementation guide. We're starting to pull in SCN feedback. We're not quite there yet because of some things that need to be resolved first, but the SCNs will be actually engaged in providing a pretty decent amount of feedback into this early on before they start deploying. So
Yeah, and I think we
And
would
if I could,
Oh, go ahead, Corey.
well, I just think so. I just want to tease apart. There's two kind of questions floating around. So we've hit on a good topic here because we're getting good engagement in the chat. So I think there's one question about sort of what are the rules for, translating between screening data and a number of, codified, terminology elements. That's sort of like, what are the rules? And what is Gravity doing? Not rules, but what are the relationships? And who is creating those relationships? And then there's another set of questions that I'm seeing in the chat about who's responsible in a given exchange scenario for applying those relationships and sort of codifying the data to capture, interpretation values or ICD-10 codes. And it looks like there's some difference of opinions in sort of where that, not just opinions, but experiences as well, in sort of where that, who is responsible for applying a set of rules or maps to get from screening responses to, interpretations of those screenings. So Jacob, I see you nodding. Am I teasing that apart? I don't know if I have answers to all those things. I'm just at least want to
No, I mean,
capture.
I obviously we're, my best friend Rob and I are, ping ponging this in the chat.
And
So
sorry, I'm jumping in too.
Yeah, jump in. This is great engagement.
And and Erica as well. So I think, ultimately this is the debate that we're having in the chat is more New York than Gravity, but I actually think that there is a Gravity role to provide some guidance because New York is not the first or the last, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how Gravity provides sort of national or even global guidance for how this might be done. And I, and you see in the chat, like my perspective based on some experience is that the QE/HIE in New York and elsewhere there is no consistent mechanism for those organizations to do, for lack of a better term, data cleaning, right? They in general sidestep the semantic responsibility that some would wish that they would take on, but in general, they're pipes through which data flows, not editors of that data. And I think this is actually a data editor role rather than a data pass-through role. And that's why I think the QE/HIE is exactly the wrong place for us to look to that work to be done. I think the SCN in New York speak is the right place for that to happen, but open to other thoughts. So I'll shut up.
Yeah, and I
Erica?
do want to say with
Armandi?
Sarah,
Yeah.
Sarah DeSilvia is not here today because she's traveling, but I know she has very clear thoughts about, you know, Gravity can't take on the entire work of mapping all the screeners that Gravity, you know. So this is going to have to be a project that is engaged, and over time, ideally, the authors of these screeners would help, you know, determine what those combinations mean and start to hardwire this into these screeners, you know, so that there's a uniform.
That's right. And I see your hand up, Rob. I think that's the key point. So I think we're in total agreement that having sort of a single authoritative group that defines how to translate data, and that might be multiple groups based on if it is the screening instrument owner or whomever it is, but having a authoritative source for each instrument is the ideal state. Rob, I see your hand up. And this is great discussion. Thank you all.
Yeah, I'll go on. See, Jacob, that's what my farm looks like if I was there. I know, I can see the palms moving in the
Yeah,
background.
tiene que venir aquí, Rob. Come on.
So, yeah, Jacob and I would be closer if I was better at getting out of Colorado. But so I think we're actually all in violent agreement. So one of the things that I think we do need to look to Gravity to resource itself to do is to do that work of developing these structure maps. I think that level all the way down to structure maps, if we're focusing on being able to say that fire is a good medium for exchange and consistent representation. Which was what Jacob was kind of saying, and Monique, the idea that an authoritative place where there's vetted analysis and agreement with regards to kind of to those mappings, that's a real good place for that to happen. And then it's wherever we get data cleansing, and I'm going to even be kind of that strict with regards to my wording. It could, it is, and I think because I've separately been involved in some discussions about what's going on with the New York 1115 work, and that there is expectation that the NHIE activity is where that's going to get cleansed up. Whether that activity occurs in a social care network associated with that, or whether we're talking about looking at how we could potentially do this in Indiana, and there it would be the HIE, it would be INPC that would take on this role. So there the pipe cleanses. But what Jacob's saying, and I absolutely agree with this, is that we can't push it all the way out to the end. I mean, as much as my understanding of the waivers is they want to push it out to the end, and someday, probably a few years from now, the CBOs might be able to do this because there'll be more, they'll actually get more resources, maybe based on this work. So to prove that by resourcing them, that we don't have to, try and do this so many different ways. I mean, that's part of what I would like to look at is how can we make this simpler. But it would be foolish to expect that it can only succeed by pushing out to all the individual endpoints. So what we can do, I hope, is that Gravity will put enough together that the intermediate steps, potentially even pipes who normally don't clean, can figure out how they can implement this easily so that they without a lot of knowledge even, but based on our guarantees that we've done a good job of being able to make sure that it works. Understanding that it shouldn't say that these are unvetted conditions, right? That these are unvetted observations. As long as we do that well, then we, I think, do improve the process so that it's more automated. So I think we're all in violent agreement. We just got to make sure that we call out what are the necessary components to make the parts that Gravity makes work. And it won't be throwing that all the way out to CBOs.
Yeah, and if I thank you both, thank you all for that. I think that's great. And I think for me, the big takeaway is it's less about while the where the rules get applied or the maps get applied is super important. That for me, the the lack of a consistent set of rules for how to translate this data that's ultimately going to get aggregated and used to drive all sorts of outcomes and equity related activities. If we don't do that consistently, it diminishes the value of the data. And I think that's really the driving, the key business reason as to why we want a consistent set of rules for interpreting and translating the same data.
Right. The
So
ideal scenario will be a repository of structure maps for, a publicly available repository of structure maps for these vetted assessment instruments.
yes, so thank you all for that. Let's see here. We have 9 minutes left, and we don't have to use all that time. When we look through the chat, I'm not seeing any other. If your question, if you put something in the chat, I tried to sort of encapsulate that in the discussion. If you feel like I missed something, please,
I think you
jump
got it
in.
all, Corey.
Yeah.
I've been kind of monitoring and
Okay.
yeah, look, I think you covered
And-
pretty much everybody's questions. Yeah.
And yeah, if there's other things that maybe, I don't know, Lloyd, I don't want to put you on the spot, but given your sort of oh wait, here we go. We have you just got saved there by Matt Bishop, Lloyd.
More
Are there,
systematic creation. Yeah.
yeah,
Can
I
I
think,
ask a few questions?
please, well, 1 second,
Yeah.
Fatima. Look, we have one question that was in the chat that we were just addressing. Can I come to you next?
Sure, please.
Sure. So Matt, I think the short answer is plans. I think plans, the answer is, I don't think there are we do not have sort of plans and funding to do the work to systematically create structure maps. We have been considering that and talking about how we do that and why we should do that for a couple of years now. But I think the plans I do not think, if I'm being just totally honest, I do not think we have plans, but I think we'd like to find a way to have plans that we could fund and drive and move that work forward.
And I'll add, and I know there's one more question, but I'll add that many of these assessment instruments weren't designed with this in mind, and you can't land something. And, going forward, that's a mindset that we're also trying to take, but I think it's still down the pipe.
Yes. Okay, great. Fatima, please, your floor.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So I've briefly looked over all the different types of information that's available. But one of the things I'm kind of not understanding is how is this coming down to the CBO level when it comes to implementing it? Are we looking at a website where we could use this as a screening tool that's actually feeding the data into the centralized system? Or what is the mechanics of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Fatima. There are many options potentially, but we've been thinking about it under the worst case scenario, assuming that there's very little technology that's fire enabled or close to that. Let's say on the CBO side, we've started with that assumption, and starting with that, the types of possible solutions are intermediaries that may offer, as you said, web portals where you can actually do your assessments on, an online portal, and when you do that, that intermediary can FHIRize it and send it upstream to the SCNs and the QEs and so on, to options where there are vendor solutions out there as well that are trying to go into the space to provide again intermediary roles. There are probably going to be discussions around, state or regional or, solutions that are, again, intermediary similar to web portal to be able to do that and to evolve that over time. So as more money is available, assuming more money is made available to be able to grow out the infrastructure needed to support CBOs to have this type of technology closer to the work that they do, that over time you kind of progress and evolve in that direction. But the role of an intermediary, like an SCN, for example, I think is going to be a very important role in the beginning, because otherwise there isn't really an easy way for the CBOs to communicate that information in these complex structured data formats, right?
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Those
wish
are
we had
my
easy. I
thoughts.
wish we had. I wish we had easier questions. I agree, and I think just highlighting, and this is obvious, right? But as one of the pieces of the work Gravity just, kind of wrapped up was a discovery. What was engaged? Sorry, excuse me. Was a the social care co-design project where we engaged a bunch of CBOs on sort of, what are their pain points and needs, et cetera. And I think that wouldn't surprise us all is that the funding needed to invest in technology infrastructure that these organizations, and many of them do not have today, is just not present. And so that's to make these change, to use tools, and to the tools often cost money. So I think I just want to highlight that's something we hear consistently from our social care our CBO.
So
colleagues.
are you familiar with so here's the thing. Pretty much all of this is being driven through EHRs.
I'm not sure about the screening. I'm not sure if, yes, certainly in a clinical scenario, screening.
The screening instruments that you are embedding, they are the front end for that is basically any of the EHRs.
I don't think that's our assumption. Yeah. Well, Jacob is kind of doing this, but I
Definitely not. So again, I'm myopic, looking at New York or looking through my New York shaped glasses. But in New York, DOH has been very explicit that they are expecting the primary actors here to be community-based organizations. They don't have EHRs. So they may have pencil and paper. They may have a product, Unite Us or a
CRM, Salesforce kind of
maybe a
solution.
Salesforce. I don't know of anybody actually trying to use Salesforce, because remember the structure here for post waiver is that there will be a social care network in every region of New York. Each of those social care networks will invest in an IT infrastructure that they will provide to their whole community. And in most cases, that will be either Find Help, formerly known as Aunt Bertha, or Unite Us. So that would be the primary tool through which these screenings are likely to occur, rather than an EHR.
I see. So you're expecting that every state would have a SCN informatics program that a CBO would actually adopt or implement.
Maybe a better way to say it is that every solution will probably need an intermediary. That intermediary may not necessarily be an SCN. So in California, they took a little bit of a different approach, and they're using QHIOs, and so in that role. But I think in order for this to work, because it's too expensive to have CBOs. I mean, CBOs can't afford to all of a sudden be FHIR enabled or adopt these standards. So there'll need to be some intermediary to communicate with the CBOs at the level that they're at today, and help them, kind of mature over time. And that's a function of funding, as well as, education, technical education, and adoption. And so, but it may be of different flavors. Certainly New York is a very different flavor than California, which is a very different flavor than Missouri right now. And so they,
So just a time check. I want to be just mindful. We have less than 1 minute left here, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think we probably have to close, or we're going to go over. So I want to thank everyone for the engagement. We do this every month on different topics, but this is a great place to come and have these kinds of discussions. And there are other ways to engage with us at Gravity, which you can find, I think, presented before. But again, want to thank everyone for your time today. Monique, Jim, for your presentations, everyone for your questions. We're all figuring this out together, and I think it requires the solution. We have to come together to figure out these problems, because they're hard, and we have to kind of figure them out together. So appreciate everyone coming today, and have a great afternoon. And we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.